This is Lorenzo, and this is the Training Routines Taxonomy video series. This is lesson number 3, and it's on the 3 different types of exercise practices. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to differentiate between the 4 different types of mobility practices or stretches, the 6 different types of stability static holds, as well as the 5 different types of stationary and locomotive dynamic based power movements. Now, before we get started, it's really important that we make the distinction between a practice and a skill. The skill is what you're working towards. It's the benchmark. It's the performance target. It's a demonstration of strength. You can also think of it as an assessment or a diagnostic. The practice then are the exercises we use as a way to unlock or make progress towards that benchmark. So for example, we know that the bridge is one of the 4 mobility benchmarks. So this is going to be one of our skills. Now the exercises or stretches that we work on to unlock our bridge will be practices. Now, how do we know what those exercises are? Well, we have to sit down and think about what are the requirements for the bridge. Well, we know that we need shoulder mobility, thoracic, wrist, as well as hip flexor mobility. So now we know we need at least a shoulder, thoracic, wrist, and a hip flexor stretch. These stretches are the practices. However, and this is the take-home message, the bridge is both a skill and a practice, but the practices are not necessarily skills. Now, with that in mind, and moving on to our first exercise practice type, mobility as a skill is flexibility under load, but as a practice, it is stationary, static, and dynamic end range holds, resulting in enhanced ankle, hip, thoracic, shoulder, and wrist flexibility under load. Finally, our mobility exercises, it serves as a foundation for and also a warm-up to our stability and power-based exercise practices. Now, as I said, mobility as a skill is flexibility under load. But flexibility of what? Flexibility is just a concept. What is flexible? Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, ankle flexibility, hip flexibility, thoracic, shoulder, wrist. These are the big 5 joints involved in mobility. And the reason you always see these joints come up is because there are certain joints of the body that specialize in mobility and some joints that specialize more in providing stability and some joints that do both. For example, in this image, we can see that all the joints in red are mobility and all the ones in orange are stability-based joints. So for example, our big 5 joints that we're concerned with is the shoulder, thoracic, wrist, hip, and ankle. Together then, mobility as a skill is flexibility under load in the ankle, hip, thoracic, shoulder, and wrist joints. And then mobility as a practice are the end range holds that can be done dynamically or statically in a stationary position. And in those positions, we can either contract and relax. So for example, an end range ankle hold would be the Achilles stretch or the fisherman's pose. For the hip, an end range hip hold would be the tailor's pose. This would be the hip in the frontal plane, stretching the adductors. Another hip end range hold would be the pike fold, stretching our hamstrings. Technically, it's not just hips, but also the knee, putting it into maximal stretch. And yet another hip end range hold, we have the couch stretch, targeting the hip flexors. We've got the rectus femoris, as well as the iliopsoas. Next, what would an end range thoracic and shoulder hold look like? Well, we have the butcher's block for shoulder and thoracic. And for our final example, we have an end range wrist hold, as we can see here with our wrist series. Now, the reason I say 4 different types of mobility-based practices is because there are 4 different types of stretch profile combinations. We have static and dynamic, contract and relax. If we put them together, we have static, contract, static, relax, dynamic, contract, and dynamic, relax that we can apply to all of these positions. So just as an example, whenever I do my stretches, I first do static and relax. I ease into my stretch for about 30 seconds. I'm not doing anything. I'm not contracting. I'm just easing into the stretch. Then I would do dynamic relax. I would then move my knees up and down without contracting. Then I would do static contract. I would then push down, as you can see here, and then I'll just contract. And I'll do it 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off, 5 seconds on, 5 seconds off. And then I would end my routine with a dynamic contract set. This is where I would be pushing down on my knees, but I'm also pushing my knees back up. So I'm moving up and down while contracting. To bring it all together now, remember I said mobility as a skill is flexibility under load, and mobility as a practice are the actual stretches. For example, we can see that the tailor's pose and the pike fold, they help you integrate and work towards the middle split as a goal. We can see that the pike fold as well as the vertical lunge help you work towards another benchmark, which is the front split. The vertical lunge, the butcher's block, the wrist series all help us unlock our bridge. We can see the vertical lunge and the pike fold are both involved also in the front split. The pike fold and the tailor's pose help us unlock the middle split. So in conclusion, we have 4 mobility benchmarks or skills: the middle split, the front split, a back bend, so the bridge, a forward fold, we have the pike. All the other exercises are therefore practices. But remember, all benchmarks and skills are also practices, but not all practices are skills.